So good evening, everyone. I'm Julia Peterson, and I work with New Hampshire Sea Grant and UNH Cooperative Extension. So glad you could join us this evening. I'm here with a colleague, former colleague, Emma Erler, and our guests, our municipal hosts, Dina Hoffman from the town of Pelham and Dawn Twamala from Merrimack, and Tom Swenson from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. And I really wanted to thank them for reaching out and working with us to help carry out this event, this educational workshop. And now thank you to all of you who gave us some of your time and attention this evening. Emma, by the way, is with my Squam Lake Natural Science Center. She was formerly with Cooperative Extension, and that's how we knew each other as on the ag program team, and that's how we know each other. I've worked on the water resources side. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, Nod, if you can see that. Great, thanks. All right. So tonight, this is as you in a virtual workshop format. I just wanted to make sure that people feel free to raise your hand, ask a question, make a comment. Feel free to use that chat function. Do be aware if anything that goes into the chat is viewable by anybody who saves the chat. I'm not sure how familiar folks are with Zoom, but just wanted to make sure that there's not really any such thing as a private chat in Zoom. It does become visible. We will open there. Generally speaking, we ask that you keep yourself muted, although there will be times that we'll encourage you to bring up questions or comments, or we'll have a little discussion. So we'll ask you to unmute at those times. I think we're going to have a fairly small group, which means that I think we'll be able to have plenty of back and forth. We also invite you, if there's something that's on your mind and you want to get it down, feel free to use the chat function, and we'll make sure that one of us takes a look at that. We have incorporated a few questions where we're going to ask you some questions, and then we're going to invite you to put a response into the chat, so to keep things lively and interactive. And then finally, later on this evening or tomorrow, you'll receive a link for an online survey about your experience with this event, and we'll ask you to respond to that. So I'll send you an email later on about that. So we have asked Dina and Dawn to describe a little bit why they were interested in hosting this workshop. So I'm going to give them a chance to describe that. So Dina, you're up first.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dina. I work for the town of Pelham as the Environmental Regulation Compliance Specialist. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the MS4 permit in Pelham. This is the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System Permit, which is quite a long name. This is an EPA issued permit, and what it does is it helps us to regulate polluted runoff and work to reduce pollutants that enter our water bodies. One pollutant can be excess fertilizer, which adds nutrients in, which can be problematic. Next slide, please. So I'd like to talk about one specific water body tonight, and that is Long Pond. Long Pond is where our public beach is. This is where a lot of people come during the summer. And what we have here, though, is a cyanobacteria and phosphorus impairment. And an impairment means that it does not meet New Hampshire water quality standards. Since we have both of those, doing things like this presentation helps us with our EPA permit. That way we can also work to reduce pollutants on the individual level. Next slide, please. So why does Pelham care about this? We care about the health of our residents, our wildlife, our pets. If you end up having a cyanobacteria algal bloom, which can happen when you have an impairment, it can be toxic and harmful to our residents as well as our pets. We want to make sure that we have clean water for everyone. We also want to continue being able to swim, fish, boat, etc. And also the aesthetic and property value. Clean water is great to look at, and it's even better when you get to live right on the water too. Lastly, we want to think about the future generations of Pelham residents and those who come to visit. People deserve to have clean water, and we do our best to help every day in little ways that we can all participate in. And that is it for me. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. My name is Dina, and thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thanks, Dina. And now Dawn from Merrimack.
Unmuting helps. Thank you. Merrimack is also under the MS4 EPA regulations. So everything that Dina said also applies to Merrimack. So if you know anything about Merrimack, we have a lot of water. We're bounded on the east by the Merrimack River. Our northern boundary has Babusick Brook, which comes out of Babusick Lake. We have the Souhegan River, which basically divides the town into two parts. And then we have Natticook Brook that comes out of the Natticook Lake. And then we have Pennachuck Brook that runs along our southern boundary. So we have water everywhere. Next slide, please. So we also have the impairments, the water quality impairments in some of our waters. So the Merrimack River, of course, has the E. coli, and that's also coming into, in addition to, it's coming in from the north. We have Babusick Lake, which has phosphorus, and we share that with the town of Amherst. Natticook Lake is all ours, and that's E. coli. And Horseshoe Pond, Babusick Brook, Souhegan River, and Pennachuck Brook. The last three rivers and brooks also come from other towns and then come into Merrimack. So we're the depository for a lot of the water coming from the properties or all the townships to the west, and they all end up in the Merrimack River. In addition to, I should have said, I'm the Deputy DPW Director and Town Engineer for the town of Merrimack, and part of my job is to oversee the MS4 program here. Next slide. So we're doing a couple of different things in Merrimack, one of which we have applied for and received the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. We're doing a study on the Babusick Lake to see what we can do for our drainage. We don't own a whole lot of land out in that area, so it's really difficult for us to be able to treat the stormwater, but we're going to study that this year and hopefully be able to come up with some solutions to be able to help that brook, or help the lake, I should say. Amherst has done a number of different things, and the Lake Association has been very strong in that area. Next slide. So the other thing we're doing is on the Natticook Lake, and one thing we have just completed was a beach restoration project. We dredged out material in the lake that had been there for, I don't know, about 20 years. All of the sand from the beach kept washing down, but the sand also has the nutrients in it from up above and from the runoff. There's a septic system up above and a road and whatnot. So we also created a perched beach. So what this does will eliminate the runoff. It creates a really flat beach, and it's up against the water, so it holds the sand back. And then we've got a slight slope, a 3-to-1 slope going up to the top of the hill, which we've now loamed and seeded. And at the top of the hill, which you can't see, is a swale. We've created a ditch line, so it actually traps all of the sediments coming down from up above. And we have a treatment area going on. So before it can get to the lake, we're now treating a lot of that runoff before it even gets there. So this is phase 1 and 2. Phase 3 will be putting in the new docks And phase 4 is just beyond those trees that you see on the picture on the bottom. There'll be another phase just like this one, so it'll look very similar. We've held all of the vegetation around it. We didn't cut down any vegetation, so we were only taking the existing sand and we cut it back. And so that's basically what we've done for that. But that's also going to be helping the lake out and minimizing the amount of phosphorus that will be going into the lake. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Dawn. So as you can see, municipalities have very compelling reasons to care about clean water and are actively working to help protect and preserve water resources throughout New Hampshire. And we're so pleased that we can partner with them in terms of education and sort of the technical assistance to figure out ways to do that. So today, from my perspective, what I hope folks who attend this workshop will do is be able to recognize the connection between what happens on the land, especially at our residential scale, right, on our own properties, connection between what we do with the land and clean water. We'll learn some cultural practices, and by that I mean how we actually grow our lawns, install them and maintain them. So we'll learn some cultural practices that encourage healthy turf and at the same time reduce the likelihood that our lawns will contribute negatively to water pollution. And hopefully there'll be something that you hear tonight that you'll think, well, I can do that you can either promote with people that you know or adopt as a new practice that might help water quality and grow a beautiful lawn. All right, so I have a little poll question here. If you could just type into the chat, who at your home or where you're residing, who takes care of your lawn? And then you can say myself, a service, someone else in my household. Just type something into the chat. So the right people are here as far as I'm concerned. Great. Glad to see that. All right. So that's helpful for me to know. That way we can also address some of your particular questions that are coming up. So in terms of the presentation outline, basically we'll cover in the beginning, just sort of make sure we have that background information on the land water connection. Then I'm going to run through some lawn care recommendations that help us grow healthy turf without the need for additional fertilizer, because healthy turf can withstand all kinds of stressors. And that's really the basis for this presentation. Then there are going to be times when, in order to grow a healthy lawn, a person will need to add some fertilizer, and Emma will cover how to determine that and what kind of choices you have and what might be the best choice under the circumstances for your particular property. We'll wrap that up and make sure that we address as many questions and comments as we can. So we are fortunate to live in an area rich with water resources. And I think many of us can claim that we have a favorite lake or river or stream or bay or beach. I certainly do. And when someone in my line of work thinks about water bodies, we always think about water quality in terms of the watershed. And the watershed concept is a little bit of a tricky one, because the word watershed actually relates to all of the land that drains into a particular water body or a connected system of water bodies. So a watershed describes the land, the high point around that land, right, that captures all of that precipitation. That high point is the edge of the watershed. You can see how I'm tracing my cursor around this white line. Those are the high points on the land. So that means that any drop of rain or snow that falls within that white boundary is going to flow down eventually into this river, or into these streams and into this river or a bay or ocean. So a water quality is highly, highly determined by what goes on within its watershed. And where does all that water go? Well, it might flow directly, as you can see here, off a parking lot into a water body. In a more urbanized area, it actually might flow along the street and down into a storm drain. And then that storm drain typically leads directly to a water body, right, where it drains across the beach. Here you can see evidence of erosion as that outfall is carrying water from a storm drain into a lake. So in New England, we typically think of these categories of water pollution. And if I were doing this presentation in Maine, where I live, this would be the same list, or other parts of New England. So typically we think about water pollution in terms of sediments, sand and silt, right? That erodes off the landscape. Pathogens, these are disease-causing organisms. Toxic contaminants, these are the ones that we think about, chemical pollutants that might come from industry or from automobiles. Salt, of course, this is the salt from wintertime, and then excess nutrients. And typically we're talking about phosphorus and nitrogen. So I did want to mention that all of these contaminants, right, the pollution problems are exacerbated by increasing amounts of impervious cover, that means pavement, that make water flow more quickly off the landscape, right, as soon as it falls, and flow downhill, as well as climate change, where we see some flashier, more intense, or more frequent storms. Tonight, we will be focusing on excess nutrients. You can tell by what the remarks that Dawn and Dina both made, that these are excess nutrients lead to some of the pollution problems right in your geographic area. So of course, the tricky thing about nutrients is that they are needed by all living things, right? Organisms need nutrients in order to synthesize proteins. So they're critical building blocks for living things. However, in excess, nutrients become water and stimulate water pollution. So what they do is they stimulate aquatic plant growth, we call that algae, which results in murky water and low dissolved oxygen levels in water, which create a harmful ecosystem. Excess nutrients can also trigger cyanobacteria blooms, and Dina mentioned some of those, right? Cyanobacteria is a particular type of harmful algae, which can make pets or people sick when it's ingested. And nitrates, if nitrates get into a well or into a drinking water supply in excess, they create a health hazard, right? If you've ever heard of blue baby syndrome, particularly for infants. So that's another way that excess nutrients can be harmful. So you might be wondering, well, where do all these nutrients come from, right? So that's the interesting thing. And the tricky part is that they come from just about everywhere, right? Up in the atmosphere. So you can see on this little diagram, I like this one. So everywhere you see a red arrow, that symbolizes nitrogen, excess nitrogen coming off the landscape. The green arrow symbolizes excess phosphorus coming off. And these are wastewater treatment, or might be from coal-fired power plants or industrial sources. They come from agricultural sources, and they certainly come from residential sources. So they're ubiquitous in the environment. And here is a diagram that I really like to use to sort of describe the effect of nutrients. And this diagram represents a process we call eutrophication. Eutrophication is a natural process. However, it's one of those natural processes that gets accelerated by human activities. So nitrogen is considered the limiting nutrient where I live on the coast in saltwater, bays, and oceans. Phosphorus is the limiting factor in freshwater. All right, so but we'll talk about both of them because their effect in a water body is quite similar. And what they do is they, of course, stimulate plant growth. Now, in aquatic environments, algae are very, very, very sensitive to even small amounts of nutrients. So even though you may apply your your fertilizer or nutrients to terrestrial plants, even small amounts that flow into water can trigger these algae. These algae blooms can occur because of the excess nutrients stimulating plant growth. The algae die off, and it's during this decay and decomposition process that the bacteria use up oxygen. That's why high levels of nutrients are associated with low levels of oxygen. And once oxygen is depleted in water body, right, that certainly is going to affect any aquatic life and dictate whether or not aquatic life can survive there. Another thing that can happen is as the water becomes cloudier, right, then the sun's rays are no longer able to penetrate. Now, ordinarily, the sun's rays, if the water is clear, those sun's rays can support helpful aquatic plants, which, when they're living, can pull those nutrients out of the water for their own growth. So they help to actually reduce the amount or the likelihood of an algae bloom when they're the appropriate kinds of plants as opposed to. So SAV right here you see stands for submerged aquatic vegetation. So that's what's happening. The interesting thing about phosphorus is that it's considered a kind of a sticky nutrient, and phosphorus clings to sediment. So when you see sediment as a pollutant, chances are you're also getting phosphorus as a pollutant. And that's that's kind of a double whammy. All right. I put up this slide about the nitrogen cycle to describe a little bit about some of the challenges with nitrogen. So nitrogen is, it comes in multiple forms, and it has the ability to transform very quickly depending on what's going on in the environment. So nitrogen, of course, we all know is in the atmosphere, right? But in the presence of nitrogen-fixing bacteria, like that comes associated with legumes, such as white clover or soybeans or different peas, right? These legumes, these nitrogen-fixing bacteria in conjunction with legumes have the ability to transform atmospheric nitrogen into the kind of nitrogen that plants can use. So that's one way to increase the amount of nitrogen we have in soil, is by the presence or the usability of the nitrogen in the soil is really what it is when we have those legumes growing in our soil. Of course, decomposers, right, take plant material and break it apart into its components, and that makes nitrogen or phosphorus more available. But something interesting happens over here. The denitrifying bacteria, which do their work in highly saturated soils. All right, can you think of some places in New Hampshire where you have highly saturated soils? Anybody want to throw something in the chat? Where might you find highly saturated soils? Anybody? How about wetlands, right? So these bacteria can do their job most easily in wetlands, and they take nitrogen that's in the water and soil, and they actually transform it back into atmospheric nitrogen. So you can see that nitrogen is always changing form, and that's one reason it can be kind of tricky to measure and tricky to track down and filter. All right. So whenever we have, but you can see because of that transformative process and the bacterial activity within healthy soils, plants and healthy soils filter water on its way downhill. So the gold standard, of course, for water quality protection is land conservation. If you want clean water, conserve land, right? Don't allow it to be, or that means preventing water from shedding off the impervious surfaces. Allow water to sink into the soil and do its work with plants and soil microbes. Here you can see a rain garden being installed. This is sort of a human engineered way to work with nature to filter water and infiltrate water. And here you can see what happens when water is shedding off the landscape with no plants, no vegetation, and no soil to help do that filtration and that infiltration. All right. At this point, are there any questions or comments anybody wants to bring up? Okay, I don't. Tom, you see anything in the chat?
Nope, nothing in the chat at the moment.
All right. So we're going to go through a series of recommendations about lawn care and about, and these are all related to, certainly cooperative extension has worked in agriculture and lawn care for many, many years, but over 10, well, it was about a little over 10 years ago, I was working with a team of other Sea Grant and extension folks, water resource extension folks within the region. And we realized that we needed to know from a turf scientist what would be the best recommendations to give people that would allow them to grow healthy lawns and at the same time reduce the likelihood that they would be, that nitrogen would be, and phosphorus would be coming off the landscape into our water bodies. So he worked with us to make sure we had a scientific rationale for some recommendations, and that's what you're going to be seeing tonight. In addition, we worked with a social scientist who helped us understand what is it that people are already doing and what are they willing to do in terms of what kinds of practices we could promote successfully. So we ended up with a very handy bulletin that helps to inform all of our information. We worked with an advisory group, including folks who owned garden centers and could tell us what kinds of things people were interested and people asked about within their shops. And again, we worked with that social scientist to learn what might be the most successful way for us to approach this kind of messaging. And we also conducted an evaluation on a little pilot program that was conducted in the state of Maine. So one of the questions we asked folks during our survey, which was the big, a big survey that went out throughout New England, were which were some lawn characteristics that are most important to you? So if you could just type that into the chat. For example, is having a lawn that's very green important to you? Having a lawn that's very dense? Having a lawn that's weed-free? Having a lawn that looks like a golf course quality? Having a lawn that's where you can play? Having a lawn that's safe for kids and pets? One of them. Having a lawn that's safe for the environment. So if you could just type something into the chat about what you think about when you're trying to describe or trying to achieve the lawn characteristics you want. Green, soft, and safe for pets. Yep. Safe for kids and pets. Safe for the environment at my camp. Bush trees and wildflowers. Green, not patchy. Good. That's cause ants. Those ants might be aerating the soil for you. All right. Great. So many of the characteristics that you put into the chat were very commonly found across New England. And interestingly, the top one we found was safe for the environment. And that was really important for us to hear because then we realized, okay, so it is worth talking about this. And then very similar to many of you wanting something that's, dense, kind of dense and full and green, safe for pets. Certainly safe for children, green and healthy. Yeah, so many of the same, and aesthetic, right? That looks good. So many of the same characteristics. Oh, here they are. So this is how people in New England answered this, and around the year was like 2009, somewhere around there. So again, you can see that importance of having a safe lawn for the environment. So that was encouraging to us. All right. So now I'm going to go into a set of recommendations. And again, the idea here behind these recommendations is how can we create lawn that will actually, that is robust and healthy enough that it can survive stressors. Stressors like drought, stressors like wear and tear, stressors like sometimes variable temperatures, and stressors like insects, and stressors like maybe a questionable amount of nutrients. So that's the idea behind this set of recommendations, is to just grow the strongest grass plant that we can without additional fertilizer. With the idea being, again, that under certain conditions, right, that grass can actually take up nutrients that might be flowing over the landscape, as opposed to giving off nutrients that might be flowing over the landscape. All right, so these are basically the recommendations, and I'll go into these in a little bit more detail. So by the right place and the right plant, one thing that we can do is limit the amount of lawn area to the places that we play and we picnic, right? I saw so many of the things that you wrote into the chat were related to enjoying, to characteristics that it sound like help us to enjoy that time with our family and with our friends and with our pets, right, out in the lawn. So alternatively, I know a lot of people will say, well, you know, I actually don't need the same size lawn that I used to because my kids have grown. So maybe in place of that, you may want to add more of a wildflower kind of garden or landscape. Another really important thing to take into consideration is that turf has a season. And there are some kind of normal cycles to expect. Sometimes I think what happens is people are looking at their lawn and they're thinking, well, this doesn't really look the way I want it to. And they automatically think that something is wrong without realizing that turf actually has some seasonality to it. So right about now, right, I've been looking around my neighborhood, and as I go about doing my errands, I'm seeing some lawns are really starting to green up just about now, right? So we'll see this spring surge right up through the end of the spring into the early summer. And then we see right here, right, during those hot July and August days when there's often less rain, the grass is, the lawn is actually going into a dormant stage. This is normal, right? And this might start to look maybe a little bit patchy or a little bit not at its greenest or fullest or densest. But note what happens as we come into September and October and November. And I don't know how many of you notice this, but check it out in the fall and you'll notice like, wow, everybody's lawn is so green again. And this is what happened. There's a fall recovery period. That happens in the fall. And then we have that winter die off. And then it comes right back in the spring. So one of the things that we can do is make sure that we choose grass varieties, right, that are suited to the northern New England environment. So we're going to recommend some grass mixes, and we always recommend mixes versus a monoculture, right, because then you get multiple benefits from the different types of species. We encourage people to overseed when needed. So that means just adding additional seed onto patches that maybe seem a little bit bare, and to plant. And although it can be done in the spring, really for best results, and Emma maybe talking about this a little bit later, plant that new lawn in the early fall for the best results, because then you'll have less weeds. So we're going to encourage a lot of the tall fescues and the fine fescues, the reason being that those have very high tolerances for conditions in northern New England. However, we also encourage some mix with the perennial ryegrass. Perennial ryegrass in particular germinates very quickly. So if you need to get grass down in an area very quickly so that it doesn't erode, for example, then you might want to go a little heavier in the perennial ryegrass in that area. And then Kentucky bluegrass is a lovely grass. It's got high tolerance for cold and wear. However, it does require more fertilizer in order to stay healthy. So the tall fescues and the fine fescues, these are like the rugged New Englanders, right? They can put up with anything. So those are a couple that we we encourage. So typically we'll say, make sure your grass mix, and when you look at the bag in the shop, you'll see the composition of the types of grasses. You want the tall fescues and the fine fescues to be like around 65% of the mix. And then that remaining 35% go with some perennial ryegrass and some mixture of Kentucky. All right. Whenever you can, incorporate some clover. You may have some clover in your yard already, or you may want to actually buy some seed. Okay, so that said, because again, that clover is a legume and it will help to convert any nitrogen that is present in the soil, help make it available to plants. So the clover actually naturally fixes the nitrogen in the soil. We do find sometimes people will call and Emma can certainly speak to this, they'll call the education center at Cooperative Extension, will say, I have too much clover, right? Clover kind of has its ups and downs, I think, in terms of favorability, but we do find sometimes people call, they feel like they want a little less clover. So we encourage people to keep the clover less than 10% of your seed mix. I've put some in my lawn and the seeds are very, very tiny. So just be aware of that. So a little can go a long way. And I think that's what I'll say about that. Of course, disregard this recommendation if there are any allergies to bee stings in your household. Now, when we worked with our social scientists in our study, we said, well, can we promote clover? Are people willing to have clover? And people are willing to have clover. So for very, very few people was it important to have a clover-free lawn. So we know it's socially acceptable, so to speak. All right, here's a really big one, most smart. The reason being, as you can see in this diagram, and you could see in the previous diagram where you saw the seasonality of the lawn, right, the turf grass, is that when you see high blade above the soil, you're also going to have deeper roots below the soil. When our lawns get too trim, that also reduces the amount of root growth, and small roots are going to be less robust. Remember, we're after that robust plant that can withstand all kinds of stressors. So we encourage folks mow high. By high, we mean about 3 inches. Leave the clippings on the lawn. We do encourage folks, if you have you've been away for a month or whatever, and the lawn is extremely high, just cut a third. Don't cut more than a third of the blade at a time. So it may take multiple passes over that lawn to get down to that, if it's exceptionally high. Are people willing to mow high? Absolutely. And leave the clippings? Very willing. So we know that this is good advice that people will follow. And of course, the clippings, right, they'll degrade into a sort of like a light fertilizer. They just decompose. And it's like having your own free light fertilizer whenever we leave the clippings. Watering wisely. This is a really important one. There's been some recent research that showed that watering too heavily pushed the nitrogen from the root zone past the root zone deep into the soil where it was no longer available to the plant. So overwatering can be like wasting fertilizer, right? Because it pushes that nitrogen through, and then that nitrogen might actually go into your aquifer or into a water body because it's sort of left the root zone. So we encourage folks, if you need to water, if there hasn't been enough rain, up to 1 inch of water per week. This is actually the average amount of rainfall in New Hampshire. That falls. So it's actually can be quite rare that people need to add additional water. If you want to override that dormant stage in July for some reason, you can, by adding a little bit more water, you can keep that growth going. But even if you don't water, your grass will typically bounce back in the fall. So we encourage people to water deeply, not frequently, and try to do it before 10 o'clock in the morning for best results. That way you don't have the noonday sun, nor do you have the damp evening following. So before 10 o'clock in the morning seems to work best. And then the final recommendation I think I'm going to be covering is to get a soil test. You'll note that a soil test will tell you exactly what the pH is and the level of organic matter. Those are both really important for growing healthy turf. Again, this has nothing to do with fertilizer, right? Organic matter can if you're using an organic fertilizer, but the pH, right, is related to how acidic or alkaline the soil is. And a soil test will tell us that. In New Hampshire, right, our soils tend to be a little bit acidic, basically because of our, that means below the number 7, right? That's basically because of our granite bedrock. And that's actually just the right level for growing grass. It's the optimum. It's for turf. That's a great pH. And then the organic matter, we want that up around 5% or so. And Emma's going to cover this a little bit more later. So, and you will notice that the reason the soil pH matters so much is because when it's in the optimum range, right, between 6 and 6.5, that is when the plant is most able to pick up the existing nutrients. So in other words, if the soil is way too low, if the pH is way too low, no matter how much fertilizer was put down, that plant would not be able to pick it up. So that's why that optimum pH is so important, and why so often a recommendation will be for folks in New Hampshire to add lime to bring their soil. And then, again, incorporating compost or some other organic material into the soil can be very important to get that right percentage, somewhere up 3 to 5%. Important message here is that compost can have very high phosphorus levels. Sometimes people think, oh, it's natural, it's harmless. Not necessarily. Compost does tend to have high phosphorus levels. Our soils tend to have adequate phosphorus levels. So compost needs to be applied very gently. And I think Emma's going to talk about that a little bit more. Emma, do you want to step in here?
Let me unmute myself. Yeah, so something that's really common for New Hampshire lawns is having a very sandy, dry soil that's very low in organic matter. That's true at my own house. It's a very sandy soil that doesn't maintain moisture very well. So what I used to recommend to people all the time when I was working for Extension, and I still would, if you have those sorts of conditions, is to top dress with compost over your lawn. So essentially, if recycling grass clippings isn't enough, which it isn't in many cases, you are helping build up that organic matter by putting on a thin layer of compost. It's important that that layer is thin, so no more than 1/4 inch, because you don't want to bury the crown of that grass plant. The growing point for our cool season turf grasses that we have in our lawns is close to the ground. So you don't want to completely bury that, but 1/4 inch of compost, ideally that's been screened so it doesn't have big chunks in it, spread evenly over the lawn, easy to do, just put shovelfuls out, rake it in, really helps a lot for adding nutrients, improving nutrient uptake actually, and improving water holding capacity of that soil.
And I think at this one of the things that we did learn during our survey work was that in many cases, people were happy with their lawns the way they were. And if that's the case, then it's really important to remember that there's no need to add anything additional. Remember, because all of that material can flow downhill into your water body. And if there was something that you were not willing to throw into a water body, then you wouldn't want to put it on your lawn because that's where it's going to. All right. Any questions or comments at this point? Feel free to put them in the chat, or we're small enough to raise your hand or unmute.
There's nothing in the chat, Julia.
Hi, I'm having trouble unmuting, but I'm watching this because I have horrible lawn. Traditionally, it's been wonderful. Now it's full of moss and everything, and I'm sure it's the pH. I've been resisting a soil test. It's definitely what it's going to need.
You
Yeah,
want moss a little bit, Emma?
pH. I was going to say moss is often related to soil pH. Moss tends to thrive when the soil pH is below 6.0,
Yeah.
whereas turf grass really thrives if that pH is around 6.5. So testing that alone would be good. And even if, I would absolutely advocate for doing the full university test just because it's going to give you a whole lot more information. But if you don't want to do that, even just a hardware store test is better than nothing. Although I did the price comparison on that, and just the little dip strips just for pH, I think was like $12 on average. And the like full test from UNH or from UMaine or UMass, it's like $20.
Tell me, how many places around the lawn do you have to test from?
So basically, when you test, you just want to get an average of what the conditions are like in your lawn. So if you think the soil is pretty much the same across your lawn, then you would probably want to test, let's say, from 6 different spots. And when I say like, is the soil basically the same? If the drainage seems different in one area versus another, you might want to do different tests. So if there's an area where the water is always pooling up or puddling when it rains, whereas other areas it drains right down through, then you might do separate tests there. Or if you know for a fact that a whole load of loam was brought in for this half of the yard and then a different load of loam was brought in for the other half, those soils could be pretty different. But for most of us, like if I was testing the soil on my own lawn, I would go out with a trowel or a soil probe if you happen to have one, but most people wouldn't. And I would just try to dig down to a depth of 3 or 4 inches, because that's where most of the grass roots are going to be.
Yep.
Mix that up in a bucket. So like take your sample from, half a dozen locations,
Okay.
mix it up in a bucket. And then if your sample, really any university lab or private lab that it's going to, at least for UNH, we just need a cup of dry soil.
Oh, okay. And I'm in Temple. Where's the closest place to take that?
So I left Extension a little over a month ago. At the time, the best way to do it actually was just to mail it to our soil testing lab on campus.
Good.
County offices once upon a time used to collect soil samples, but now everything just goes to the lab at the university. So the options were pandemic, drop it off there or mail it in, but mailing it in is definitely the best option. So dry it out as possible before you ship it.
So they only need a cup total of mixed soil. Right?
1 cup total.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
we put up the a web link at the end of the presentation for everybody to get more information. You can actually see a video of how to take a soil test, and
excellent.
That's the address for dropping.
Yeah, and it's not. I mean, even when people are doing testing frequently, it's like once every 3 to 5 years is the ideal. So it's not like you have to do it all the time. And until you test again, you can just keep working from your same results.
This is an ancient lawn, and it's due for a little improvement and help. That's all.
Yeah, I am working on the lawn at my parents' house, which
yep,
is serious need of help with weed pressure and lack of organic matter.
Great, thanks.
You're
So-
welcome. Yeah, and like if you think of questions as you go along, I have no issue with people unmuting and just asking them. We're a small group, or pop them in that chat, or hold them till the end. I'm pretty flexible here with how we do this. So Julia's going to advance my slides for me because that's the least clunky way to do this.
Emma, we do have another question if we have a second.
Oh, of
Peter
course.
wants to know, can you summarize the restrictions of fertilizer use near a water body in New Hampshire?
Absolutely. So Julia is actually going to do that at the end of this. So right now, so hold that thought, whoever put that in. Fabulous. That's to come. What I'm going to cover now is basically just the actual, nuts and bolts of fertilizer when it comes to, lawn care. Which type of, do you need fertilizer for your lawn or not? How much do you need to apply? So, how many bags are you picking up to begin with, and how much goes down at any one time? Knowing, when to apply, that's also important. Julia kind of hinted at that a little earlier, but I'll talk about that. And then choosing the right fertilizer for a situation. So not all fertilizers are created equal. And it is important to choose the right one. If we're talking lawns, what's the appropriate fertilizer for a lawn? I'm not talking about this tonight, but same goes for whether it's trees or shrubs. It's important to be choosing the right product for the situation where you have plantings. All right, so when it comes to soil nutrients, there's actually a whole bunch of them, but there are 3 that we're primarily concerned with. And those are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. There are many other nutrients, like I said, but these 3 are known as the macronutrients. And that means they are needed by all plants in high amounts. When you get your soil tested, you are going to be getting recommendations on how much of each of these 3 nutrients need to be applied. And I will talk about that more. But each of these nutrients has an important role. Nitrogen is the nutrient that really gives grass, turf grass, that green up effect. So if you're looking for some nice leaf growth, some nice foliage growth, and that really nice green color, typically that's the result of nitrogen. Phosphorus is the next nutrient. That phosphorus is best for root growth, and it's really important during the seedling stage of grass. So right after germination, it's important to have plenty of phosphorus because that's when most of that root growth is occurring. Phosphorus deficiencies are very rare, particularly in New Hampshire. So it's not usually a nutrient that needs to be put down, although occasionally it does. I used to approve soil test results for Hillsborough County, and it was, I don't even know if 5% of tests that I looked at needed phosphorus. So not very common to have issues with that. Potassium is the 3rd macronutrient. And unlike nitrogen and phosphorus, potassium doesn't really have any negative impacts on water quality, but it is really important. I think probably its most important, or the thing that it does most importantly, is provide plants with more stress tolerance. So it makes them more drought resistant, which of course is very important for our lawns and unpredictable rain patterns in New Hampshire. It's also just critical for growth in general. So you're going to be, most concerned with those 3. There are other nutrients to be aware of, like calcium, magnesium, and iron, as well as a whole slew of others. But these 3 are what you're really going to focus on for your lawn. All right, so for our region, usually the nutrients that are limiting in a lawn are nitrogen and potassium. Phosphorus is pretty much always abundant in the soil, and we don't really need to add any more. So, ideally, fertilizers that would be used in our region would be low in phosphorus or have no phosphorus in them. Now, that's not to say that if you go to your local garden center or go to one of the box stores like Home Depot and Lowe's, that the lawn fertilizers aren't going to have phosphorus in them, or they're going to be low in phosphorus. a lot of those products are still really high in phosphorus. And that's because other regions of the United States do have a phosphorus deficiency. I think it's also a case of industry being a little bit behind the times in terms of the science. So for years and years, people have known that we need that phosphorus for that root growth, for that seedling growth. But a lot of times it's applied in excess. So if you have soil test results and there's an indication that your phosphorus level is low, then getting a product that has phosphorus in it would be appropriate. And sometimes for seeding a lawn, if the phosphorus is on the lower side, adding or using a fertilizer that has phosphorus in it is appropriate, but most of the time it's not. Okay, so if you were to have your soil tested by UNH, this is what your results would look like coming back. You know, if you got your soil tested for your lawn soil. Although I'll throw it out there that if you are going to test your soil, you can get results for the same soil sample for a bunch of different crops, if you will. So you can get it for your lawn, your vegetable garden, your annuals, your perennials, your Christmas tree plantation, you name it. But if you have asked for lawn test recommendations, this is what you're going to see. In this particular sample, actually, you'll see, you know, what is pretty standard in New Hampshire. You'll note that the pH is a little low for lawns at 6.2, although the ideal often is considered 6.5. You'll see down below that the target range is 6.0 to 6.5. I'm usually aiming for that 6.5. And you'll see too that there are, you know, a bunch of nutrients listed here. So the calcium and magnesium are listed up here. Calcium is often low if it's been a while since lime was added, because that tends to be a big contributing source of calcium. The potassium level is also low. Like I said, that's really common in New Hampshire. There isn't a lot of natural potassium in our soils, so we know we need to boost that. That phosphorus level is optimal. Awesome. Means we don't have to worry about that too much. And that lead level is low. That's just something that's on all of our tests. One other thing worth noting here is that the organic matter is 5.69. That's awesome for a lawn. Typically, we would say that a lawn should have about 3 to 5% organic matter. So no need to use that compost there. And Julia, if you advance it, I think there might be some things circled here. Perfect. Okay, so we noted that potassium, phosphorus already. What, if you're paying attention here, I've mentioned 3 main nutrients to be concerned about, that nitrogen, that potassium, or nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You'll note that nitrogen isn't on here. And that's because there really isn't a good reliable way of measuring the nitrogen in the soil. Nitrogen is very unstable and it changes forms rapidly. So it's difficult to get an accurate reading in your soil. So, but yet if you go down to this recommendation section, you'll note here that there's actually a recommendation for how much nitrogen to put down. And that actually just comes from, you know, scientific study that has looked at how plants respond to nitrogen and what amount of nitrogen tends to get an optimal response. You know, the least amount of nitrogen possible to get that optimal response. Those numbers are available for really any sort of crop you could imagine. But for lawns, that standard tends to be about 0.9 pounds. I'll get onto that more. But that last circled dialogue down there at the bottom, you'll note that in this recommendation, it says for spring and fall applications of fertilizer, 25% of the total nitrogen in the fertilizer should be derived from slow release nitrogen. So slow release nitrogen, I'll touch on that more too, but basically we're talking about nitrogen that is gradually available to plants rather than available all at once. All right, go ahead, Julia. Okay, so, what does this all mean? You have your soil test results, and then how are you going to go about actually choosing a fertilizer? Well, it's helpful to know how to read a fertilizer label because by law, they all contain the same information. Might be presented slightly differently, I should say, but same information is going to be there. So first things first, you're going to see on any fertilizer bag 3 numbers. In this case, it's 12,024. These numbers represent the percentage of a nutrient that is in that product. The order that they go in is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So if I'm looking at this label, it means this particular fertilizer contains 12% nitrogen, 0% phosphorus, and 24% potassium. So, that's helpful. If we know that we don't need, let's say, any phosphorus in our soil, we're going to be looking for a product that has either 0% phosphorus or a very low percentage of phosphorus. There's also on all fertilizer bags what's called the guaranteed analysis. And this tells you the percentage of nutrients in what form they are in this product. So you'll see nitrogen is broken down here with ammoniacal nitrogen, urea nitrogen, water insoluble nitrogen, and slowly available water soluble nitrogen. That's, a lot of different types of nitrogen. Basically, this means that there is nitrogen in this product that is immediately available to plants. That would be the ammoniacal nitrogen and the urea nitrogen. And there is nitrogen that is slowly available or gradually available to plants over the course of time. That's important because if we put down all of the plant's needs of nitrogen in a form that is released immediately, a lot of that nitrogen is going to wash away before the plant can even use it versus a slowly released nitrogen source that's going to be, that nutrient's going to be gradually made available to plants over time. All right, next slide, Julia. Okay, so it's also going to be important here to figure out exactly how much fertilizer you need to apply. And so first things first, we're going back to high school math here. You need to measure the dimensions of the area you have, or the dimensions of your lawn to calculate its area in square feet. This doesn't have to be absolutely precise, but the closer you can be, the better. So it's helpful to know if your lawn is 1,000 square feet, 3,000 square feet, because all fertilizers are going to, in their instructions, tell you how far that bag of fertilizer will go. So you might pick up a product that says it will cover 5,000 square feet. Great. If you have 3,000 square foot lawn, you only need 1 bag for a single application. All right, next. It is critical when you have any fertilizer bag to read the label, and this is true for pesticides too, but on that label itself, it's going to tell you how many pounds to put down for every 1,000 square feet of lawn. So it varies a lot, but it might be 3 pounds in one product, might be 10 pounds in another product. It's something that needs to be looked at for each and every fertilizer. The label is assuming that the fertilizer is going to be put down at a rate of 0.9 pounds of nitrogen per application. And you're like, wait a second, how does that vary then? So you said this product says 3 pounds of fertilizer per 1,000 square feet, but I'm only putting down 0.9 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. That 0.9 pounds is accounting for the amount of nitrogen that is in a particular product. So with any application of fertilizer you put down, you don't want to be putting down more than 0.9 pounds of nitrogen. With some fertilizers, there's going to be more nitrogen in them than others, so a greater percentage. There's a whole bunch, there's some pretty simple math that goes into this, and I won't try to explain it in this format, but we do have a really useful fact sheet on calculating the amount of fertilizer to put down. But that's going to vary a lot. But that label, that product label, is assuming that rate of 0.9 pounds of nitrogen. And then you're also just going to want to anticipate how many times you're going to apply. Okay, so in a standard UNH soil test recommendation, you're going to see that there's the option to apply fertilizer once a year, twice a year, or 3 times a year in our recommendations. If you're trying to be as water quality friendly as possible, you're going to apply no more than 2 pounds of nitrogen per year. And if you're applying 0.9 pounds of nitrogen in an application, by extension, that means you're not putting fertilizer down more than twice a year. Ideally, you're going to apply 1/2 to 1/3 the amount recommended on the fertilizer bag. So if the recommendation is 5 pounds of fertilizer per 1,000 square feet, you're going to drop that down to 2.5 pounds per 1,000 square feet. You're going to want to look for results, of course, once you've made that fertilizer application. With a quick release nitrogen source, you'll probably see that response in the grass within just a couple of weeks. With a slow release source of nitrogen, it's going to occur over the course of many weeks. So it's just going to be a more drawn out response. And then you would only reapply at the reduced rate if your lawn response is unacceptable. So say you're not getting that green up response that you expected, or you're just not getting the growth that you were hoping for, then you could reapply again. But could be that you get more than enough with just a single application of that reduced amount. Okay, I already started touching on this, but when you're choosing a fertilizer, when you're looking at that product label, you are going to pay attention to the source of the nitrogen. So slow release forms of nitrogen are typically preferable for water quality considerations. Makes sense in that the nitrogen becomes available to the plants gradually over time versus being available all at once. It's kind of like, if you have all that nitrogen available immediately, a lot of it just goes to waste. A lot of it gets washed out of the soil, doesn't get used, versus if you have this slow release form, those nutrients or that nitrogen is going to be available over a greater period. Ideally, for water quality, look for 50% water insoluble nitrogen or slow release nitrogen. It varies what it says on the label, but greater than 50% is the ideal. It does come in both synthetic and organic forms. Synthetic forms tend to be just encapsulated, typically in different materials that gradually dissolves and releases that nutrient. An organic form just needs to be, actually requires soil microbes to be broken down. And the release, at least the nutrient release speed with a slow release fertilizer tends to depend on moisture levels and microbial activity if we're talking about organic. So organic fertilizers, super popular right now. A lot of people are going that direction. They're great and are really appropriate in a lot of situations. Organic fertilizers tend to feed the soil. So if you're more interested in permaculture or such, that feeding the soil is a good thing. And that basically means that you are feeding the microorganisms in the soil, which is excellent for soil health. Organic sources tend to supply micronutrients. So these are some of these obscure nutrients that you don't really think of, like the iron or zinc or cobalt. The main downside to using an organic fertilizer is that they may lead to over applying phosphorus. Organic sources of or organic fertilizers in general tend to have a fair amount of phosphorus in them. So if you don't need phosphorus on your lawn, adding solely an organic fertilizer may end up over applying phosphorus to try to get the right nitrogen level for your turf. And that last note there, excess nitrogen is excess nitrogen regardless of the source. So whether it's a synthetic or an organic source of fertilizer, no matter what, it's a bad thing. And then this last thing here, normal release synthetic. The this is just, your standard, lab created fertilizer. Typically not recommended. This is a fertilizer that's going to be in a form that is available to plants immediately. The only time you might use this is if the temperature was getting really low, for example, for a slow release form. This could be if you're seeding a lawn really late in the season. Say you've missed that ideal window in around Labor Day, mid-September, and now we're in late October. You might use that. If you need to push growth really quickly, so say you're seeding a hillside or something and you need a lot of growth quickly, you might use that. It's also less expensive, so that appeals to a lot of people. But you're more likely to burn plants with excess salts. And like I've said before, they're much more susceptible to leaching out of the soil. And absolutely avoid the combination products whenever you can, these weed and feed products, unless you know that they're needed. I typically would never recommend people use a combo product. I'd say get the fertilizer you need. And if you have a particular weed issue in your lawn, then choose an herbicide that's most appropriate for that particular weed, rather than do this combo product. And here is just that look again at this nitrogen breakdown. We looked at that before. But yeah, that's fine. Just a quick poll question here, for those of you that are on the call, do you currently know the square footage of your lawn? No shame here.
I haven't any idea. It's big.
Big, yep.
Well, it's around several buildings is the problem. It's not one big, it's not an estate piece. It's hither and
Yeah,
there.
so in that situation, I guess I would be inclined to kind of break it up into sections and figure out the square footage of each section if you could, if you have a long tape measure or something.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Yep.
Yeah, and that's the ideal. I mean, not only is it going to help with water quality with getting that right, but it's also going to make sure that you're not overbuying fertilizer, because it's kind of expensive.
Yeah, it'd be nice to get it done right and just stop fiddling around with it too.
Yeah, and once you figure out you have a routine that works really well, then you can just keep going with that year after year, at least until you soil test again. So if you don't know what your which it seems like a lot of you don't know the square footage, you're in good company. This survey that Julia mentioned earlier, results showed that only 44.6% of people knew the square footage of their lawn. So that's telling. Yeah. If you're going to use a fertilizer spreader, you are ideally going to want to calibrate that so that you're putting fertilizer down at the proper rate. There are some great videos on this. We have one. We have a good video on our website, actually, or on the UNH Extension website, on how to calibrate a spreader. There's also this fact sheet on it. A lot of times too, a particular fertilizer brand will have its own spreader. So if you have a Scott's spreader, the Scott's fertilizer products are already calibrated, or rather the spreader itself is calibrated for those products. So it makes it a little bit easier. But if you're mixing and matching, there's ways to do it. Okay, so is everybody actually applying fertilizer? About half of the survey respondents indicated that they do apply fertilizer to their lawns. Kind of interesting here, just over half of people apply once or twice, and only 31% apply 3 or 4 times a year, which is, I guess, not surprising when you think about, who has the plush lawn in your neighborhood. It's not everybody. It's a smaller group, maybe only about a third. Okay, so another poll here. If you have fertilizer, what do you do with it?
You can just type your response into the chat. For example, do you use what you need and then store the rest? Do you use it all up so you don't have to store it? Do you give it to a neighbor? You can just put whatever, or maybe you don't use any. So you can just put your response right into the chat. Let's see where we land.
All right, I'm liking what I'm seeing so far. Saving it, storing it. Awesome. Well, you folks that said that you've been storing it for later, also in good company. But the kind of scary thing with this survey is that a lot of people have said they just use it all up to avoid the surplus. And as you've probably gathered from this talk, that's not the appropriate way to go about it. We want to be applying at the proper rate rather than just trying to empty the bag. So storing it, keeping it dry in a bin or something like that. Most of these products, they're not going to go bad. They're not going to lose their nutrients as long as they're kept dry. That's the biggest issue. So keeping them in the garage, off of that cement where they're not going to be able to take up any moisture. Perfect. Chef's kiss. Okay. So when are you going to apply this? It's important to kind of pump the brakes right now, because the ideal time to do this is when that grass is really actively growing. So you've probably seen that green up in your lawn right now, but you probably haven't had to mow your lawn yet either. So it is still too early. The ideal really for our region is in May, typically by beginning to mid-May, even the end of May. Tends to be the ideal time in the spring to be putting down fertilizer. You don't want to do it too soon. So April, you can even see on this map, it's kind of not that peak growth phase. So plants don't really need it yet. And then you don't want to fertilize in the summer, because unless you are irrigating like crazy, because the grass typically goes more or less dormant in the summer. It slows way down, so it's not going to get used. Or you can apply in the fall. I often recommend, if you're only going to apply once a year, to do it, in the fall. And by fall, I mean like Labor Day. So late August through mid-September. And I say that because that's when grass plants tend to put on the most root growth, when the temperature starts to get a bit lower. So if you really want to get the most bang for your buck in terms of creating really healthy, resilient plants, that's the time of year I would do it. Also tends to coincide with the best time of year to renovate a lawn, that Labor Day time of year. So that's what I would say. What you don't want to do is apply really late. So late October, November, that used to be recommended. We now know that most of that product's just going to go to waste. The plants aren't going to use it. Okay. And so looking at this particular result here, just take a look at this for a second, because we're going to ask a poll question about this next. We see that the pH is great. The potassium level is low. Phosphorus level is considered high. Nitrogen, we know that that's a non-starter. Organic matter is low. Okay, so if we know that the potassium's low and the phosphorus is high, then we've got to choose a fertilizer that's going to be the most appropriate for that condition. All right, Julia.
Yep, so I put the formulations into the chat.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so looking at this test data here, which fertilizer formulation do you think would be the most appropriate for this particular lawn? And so you've got A, B, C, and D there.
Looks like we've got the advanced group.
We do. That's awesome. So for those that chimed in, B, that 1507 would be my first choice. Now we don't know, the percentage of slow release nitrogen here, but let's just assume, it's got that 50, it's met that 50% mark. there we're getting our nitrogen, we're getting, a fairly high level of potassium there and 0 phosphorus. That 4005, I guess, would be my second choice, C. That 444 in D, that's probably an organic source of nitrogen. And then A, we know we don't need that much phosphorus. One thing worth noting is that phosphorus doesn't hurt plants. I used to get that question fairly often. So having too much phosphorus is not going to hurt your lawn. But you just know from water quality standpoint that you do not need any more. There's plenty there already. I'll turn it back to you, Julia. Oh, you were muted.
Somebody had mentioned, sorry. Thank you, Emma. That was awesome. Somebody had mentioned earlier, questioning about properties that are right on water bodies. And there is, New Hampshire has the Shoreline Water Quality Protection Act. And what that act says is that within the waterfront zone, right, lime can be used anywhere. So where you see this pale green next to the water body, that's the first 25 feet, right? Within this area, lime may be used. No fertilizers can be applied in that zone, all right? Above that zone, slow release nitrogen and low phosphorus fertilizer can be used beyond that 25 feet from the reference zone. Does that answer the question that came up earlier today? I think that was.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Yes, and I will say that if you do a Google search on the DES website, there's an excellent frequently asked question sheet for folks who have interest in getting into more of the details about when you have waterfront property on the Shoreline Water Quality Protection Act. You can see here, there's a URL for the organization I work for, Sea Grant Extension, and this is a little fact sheet that summarizes a lot of the information that we went over tonight in less detail, but it sort of keeps those top level reminders, recommendations in mind. There's also a little online book that's available, especially if you belong to a conservation commission or a planning board and you're thinking about what can happen in your town. A number of us work together between Extension and DES on providing this kind of information to professional landscapers so that when they work on properties, especially on the water's edge, that they're incorporating many of these principles, as well as, so there's trainings as well as book resources. DES has some excellent programs and materials here that are geared toward residential properties and what folks can do around their home to make sure that they're promoting that infiltration of rainwater into the ground and the filtration through healthy plants and soils, especially along the water's edge, through the soak up. And they have the Soak Up the Rain program, which helps connect people to or neighborhoods to the ability to install some rain gardens. And Tom, is Soak Up the Rain active right now?
Yes, it is. And they're actually, Lisa Lucigian, who's the program coordinator, she is just starting to get into her busy season with people contacting her about looking at potential projects and helping design and give advice on things. I can post the website for Soak Up in the Rain in the chat as well if people want to take a look at it.
That'd be terrific. Thank you. Good. And I know we've really used up our time, but if anybody has any final questions or comments, do you want to pipe up with those or throw them in the chat?
Just thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody have a final burning question or comment?
You're muted again for some reason, Julia.
Oh, sorry. I was just thanking everybody. I just did a great job thanking everybody. Everybody here to thank. Thank you to Dina and Dawn for hosting us. Thank you so much, Emma. It was great to work with you again. And thank you so much, Tom, for helping us coordinate to come together to support these. Thank you. Okay, so Tom just put that Soak Up the Rain URL in the chat as well. Good. So good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.